For 97 years, the Ford Hall Forum has been engaging people in discussions and debates about issues that are on our minds and in the news. Tonight, that tradition continues as we are privileged to present a panel that is going to be focusing on peace and justice, and we are honored to have Betty Burkes, Kip Tiernan, and Renee Loth will be moderating the program. This specific program is focused on the fact that this year 1,000 women from around the world were jointly nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, a nomination. This particular nomination honors the work that women have done around the world. And Kip and Betty are two of those women. As you Indeed. And as you probably know, poet, author, and activist Grace Paley was scheduled to be with us tonight, but unfortunately she is ill. And while she is disappointed that she cannot be with us in spirit, she asked me to let everybody know that she joins us. She cannot be here in person, but she joins us in spirit, and we all wish her a speedy recovery. This fall, the Ford Hall Forum will continue to host a great roster of speakers and explore a broad range of issues, so please make sure you're on our mailing list. If you didn't pick up something when you came in, you can do it on the way back out. You'll find a brief description of our remaining fall programs in the back. It's on this yellow sheet. We hope you'll mark your calendar and come to some of the remaining ones. And please take time to fill out some of the audience survey that is also back there. Let us know what you think of our programs. And if you have a suggestion about someone you think would make a particularly interesting speaker or a topic that you'd like to see us think about presenting, let us know, because many of the programs we've done over the years have come from suggestions of our audience members. There's one more thing you can do. While the Ford Hall Forum programs are always free and open to the public, they do cost us something to put on. So I would encourage you to take some time and consider being a member. Our memberships start at $35, which absolutely is the best deal in town. So we'd appreciate your support. I'd also like to take this time to thank some of our corporations and foundations that support us on a regular basis, and those are the Lowell Institute, the Lincoln and Therese Filene Foundation, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and Northeastern University, which serves as our home base. Just a footnote, tonight's program is being recorded, and if you are sharing a comment or a question in the second half of this event, I urge you to use the microphone that is in front so that it will be heard. I also encourage you to speak slowly. The acoustics in the building, as you may be able to tell, could be a little better, so it helps if you speak a little slowly. And please understand that by asking a question and coming to the microphone, you are giving us permission to record you. With that, it's a privilege for me to begin tonight's program with some opening remarks by Thomas Menino, Mayor of the City of Boston. He has been Boston's mayor for 10 years, and tonight's theme of peace and justice is one that is near and dear to his heart. So please help me now in welcoming Mayor Menino.
Thank you, Ann. First of all, why don't we all move up close? It's not like church. There's no more collections. We have a nice, cozy conversation with everyone. See, nobody wants to move up front. Maria, come on. All right. Nobody wants to move. Okay. Ann, thank you. I'm really honored to be here to join you and the folks here and your able honorees this morning in Also, Renee Loth, who's the editorial page editor. She writes all good things about me all the time. We all know the Ford Forum has a 97-year of presenting free and public programs that engage people in really civic dialogue. While times have changed since the inception of the Ford Hall Forum, open debate, free speech, and unlimited exchange of ideas remains the hallmark of a healthy democracy. It is fitting that we gather at Faneuil Hall, where great debates about peace, justice, and human dignity took place, to continue our discussion to honor the 1,000 women worldwide who were jointly nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. All of these women have worked daily to seek justice and dignity for all and to make the world a better place. Although they come from different backgrounds, they are all working together for the common good. As my friend Kip Tiernan says, the journey to justice can only be made in the company of others. These women deserve to be recognized and celebrated. They are setting an inspiring example of the next generation of humanitarians. Tonight, we are extremely privileged to be joined, like Ann said, by two of the three nominees, all from New England. Grace Paley, the award-winning author, poet, and political activist who can't be with us tonight. Betty Burke, a member of the Cambridge Peace Commission and a former president of the U.S. Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And Kip Tiernan, we all know Kip, founder of Rosie's Place, the nation's first women's homeless shelter, and the only woman I know who had me make sandwiches for a whole year at her shelter at noontime. And speaking of Kip, we've all had the pleasure of being in her presence for many years. She has helped countless homeless women rebuild their lives. On behalf of the city, I want to thank her for 30 years of service. All of these women we mentioned deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. I want to thank all of you for joining us this evening for this discussion. I also want to thank Renee Loth for moderating this program. And just want to say that, one thing was mentioned continually is peace and justice. We have to get reactivated. We're very complacent. America is complacent more today than ever before. We're allowing government to do whatever they want to do and don't care about the people I care about, people you care about. It's about people's welfare, how they're going to get jobs, good education, and affordable housing, and make sure our environment works. So as you sit here tonight, listen to these women talk about their specialties, and Renee moderating the forum. We have to leave here. I'm on this kick these days trying to get people motivated, because things that happen in this country today, if they happened 30 years ago, we'd all be out getting our elected officials and say, why? We got to start asking the question, why? Why at places like New Orleans, where poor people lived, why did it take a president of the United States 7 days to get down there? And where you have a potential in Florida of a disaster and disaster being declared before the disaster happened. Why do we have an assault weapon ban go out of existence and not one whimper in this country? Why do we have our educational funding being cut? Go on and on and on. So we're here tonight to have a good discussion. But as you leave here tonight also, you've got to become activated. You've got to go out there and talk to elected officials. And you all belong to national organizations. Make sure those national organizations are out there representing you. Because I find from Washington national organizations, they're dead. They're not doing anything. We've got to activate them. And you've got to start right here in the Cradle of Liberty, Boston, Massachusetts, as we move forward. Thanks a million. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Menino. It's now my pleasure to introduce Renee Loth, tonight's moderator. Renee was appointed editor of the editorial page of the Boston Globe in May of 2000, having served as deputy editor for 6 years. And in her 19 years at the Globe, I understand she's held a variety of positions. As a frequent political commentator on local and national radio and TV, Renee has done such things as been a study group leader at the Kennedy School. She's been a Radcliffe Public Policy Institute Fellow. She's the recipient of many awards, including the Excellence in Media Award from the National Women's Political Caucus. Tonight's subject, peace, women, justice, is one of her passions. Please help me welcome Renee Loth.
Well, thank you. Actually, today is the 20th anniversary, my 20th anniversary at the Boston Globe, so I'm going to have to update my biography. Thank you for having me tonight. I'm thrilled to be here in this wonderful historical place and to be accompanied by these fabulous women. Are the acoustics okay? Is there too much echo? Okay. Well, as you know, the Boston Globe editorial page is a place where we take courageous stands on difficult and contentious issues. For example, peace, we're for it. Of course, it's not as simple as all that, which I'm sure we're going to be hearing about tonight. Over my 11 years of running the editorial page, I've developed my own observations about the role of women in promoting peace, especially in the developing world. I've reported and visited 14 countries, from Cuba to Guatemala to Africa, India, mostly interviewing women and the work that they're doing to promote peace and democracy and justice in their communities. And I've seen through my travels that even in the poorest societies, they are more stable and more democratic and more peaceful where families are healthy and children are educated and where the women are free. And in May, I was privileged to have met and interviewed Wangari Maathai, who was the Nobel Peace Prize winner from this just previous year, who many of you know founded something called the Green Belt Movement in her native Kenya. It's a grassroots organization of mostly women who plant trees. They do so to ward off desertification, the drying up of arable croplands, and all of the destabilizing effects that accompany this on crops and their communities and even on whole countries. The Nobel Committee's choice of Wangari Maathai was controversial, even inside the Nobel Committee, partly because Maathai is not your traditional statesman like Kissinger or Sadat or one of them, and also because planting trees did not at first seem like an obvious path to world peace. But I really think that the Nobel Committee was onto something, and I think that these nominations of the women that were made this year, the 1,000 women, are of a piece with this. Because at a time when we are all so affected by upheaval in parts of the world that are very far away, we need to better understand, I think, the intricate web of forces that move societies toward peace or toward conflict, and particularly the sometimes less obvious factors, such as the role of women in building stable and democratic societies. These are some of the issues that I hope that we're going to tease out tonight in our discussion with these two extraordinary women, who I'd like to introduce to you right now. First of all, Kip Tiernan. We all know Kip. I've probably known her for 35 years now. She's best known for founding Rosie's Place. It's the nation's first drop-in and emergency shelter for women. She's been at the center of the fight for economic and social justice in this town for nearly 3 decades. She's advocated, protested, and lobbied for affordable housing, health care, and education, as well as jobs and civil rights and traditional peace. Drawing on her early roots in the radical Catholic left movement, Kip personifies the underlying philosophy of Rosie's Place, that together we can change the world if we are willing to care enough, as the mayor said, and in her own words, to take the risk of being human. And also we're joined tonight by Betty Burkes. Betty's a lifetime educator and activist. She's been working for a world where all humans can be celebrated for their brilliance and their beauty, where people recognize their interconnectedness, and where the earth is respected and justice prevails. She has taught these principles as a Peace Corps volunteer in Africa, in the public schools in California, in private schools in England, and in the Montessori preschool she founded on Cape Cod, which offers young children an environment in which peacemaking and social justice mingle with the affirmations of childhood. I also wanted to just mention Grace Paley, who, was one of the nominees who I hoped could have been here tonight. We're all hoping for her healthy recovery, and I wanted to just say at the very end of the program, Betty has wisely located a poem of Grace's that she will read for us tonight, and so Grace can be here not only in her spirit but through her words, and that's going to be great. Okay, well, I wanted to start by asking the women, and let me just say that we want this to be a conversation where it's not going to be like a series of seriatim speeches, I hope, after I stop talking. I'd like it to be a conversation, and we are going to be turning over the program to you, the audience, in about 15 or 20 minutes. But first I had a couple of questions of my own prerogative as the moderator here. I thought I would start. To ask these two women, what is it in your observation that makes women so good, particularly women, so good at promoting peace? Is it something that is hardwired within us? Is it because women care for the children of the world that we care more about peace? Is it because that men have taken all the places on the war side, and so they've left all the room and opportunity for us on the peace side? What is it that women particularly bring to the peace table? Betty, you want to start?
Why not? Renee, I don't subscribe to the notion that women are hardwired for peacemaking. Your guess probably would be as good as mine, as anyone else in the audience. But I imagine women have found it necessary to be in relationship in a way to survive that perhaps men haven't always been so required to do. I also imagine that singling out women as peacemakers might not lead us to a very productive place around responsibility. And that a lot of who we are has to do with socialization and the way in which we are taught and the way in which we internalize values and the cultures that we grow up in. I think if we look back in history archaeologically, we will find communities and societies where men have been very powerful peacemakers. But in the traditions of the culture in which we now live, that is really grounded in greed and competition and domination and the values of patriarchal institutions, women often look more like peacemakers than men do because of the need to survive and the need to be in a web of relationships that men continually can step out of to be violent in an attempt to be in a relationship. So it's complicated. But I don't think peace building is a gender issue. I think it's a cultural and experiential issue.
Thank you. That's great. Kip, when I interviewed Wangari Maathai who had won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work with the planting of trees in Kenya, it took some thinking through what was the connection between planting a tree and world peace. And the environment had not always been seen as an agent of peace, caring about the environment. And I think a little bit about the same thing when I think about your work with homelessness. On the surface, it doesn't seem to have that much to do with war and peace. But there are connections. I'm sure that you can think of the connections between your work and making the world a more peaceful and stable place. Can you talk about that a little?
Well, I certainly don't think there will be any peace unless there is justice. And I think that women have always worked on justice issues from the very beginning. Even when they were on the balcony, in the balcony of that room when the Constitution was being framed, you know, you'd like to hope that someone was yelling down, what about women? And thanks to the Ford Forum for letting us come here today. Lord knows they don't let women in a lot of places to talk, run our mouths. But I was reminded this morning to look at that portrait up there, and I remember that one of them very clearly said, I think it was Daniel Webster, if you don't like what the government is doing, throw it up. I think the last time I spoke here in the late 80s, I suggested we have a revolution, but and I still think that's not a bad idea. I think part of the problem is we keep pulling the babies out of the stream that's rushing by, and we have yet to go upstream to see who's throwing them in. I think that we forget the roles that women played, like a Rosa Luxemburg or a Mother Jones, or Rachel Carson, who told us in the 60s that the birds would not sing again if we didn't do, she wrote The Silent Spring, if we don't do something about the environment. I think that women, Melania Cass was one of my very all-time heroines, said perhaps if we can't do great things, we can do small things in a great way. And I think women historically have done that over and over again. I think the founding of a Rosie's Place or a food bank or a lot of the other places that Fran Froelich and I started, we started them as alternatives because the economic situation had broken down completely in Boston during the 80s, and as a result, you're forced to create new realities. And I think that the things that we started not only became new realities, they are now a part of the Boston scene, the Boston Women's Fund, the Community Works, the Poor People's United Fund, Healthcare for the Homeless. All of those things were started by women, incidentally, with a lot of help from everybody else. So I think that women have a strong social and economic sense really of what is right and what is wrong. We finally got the vote, and God knows they didn't want us to have it, and one would hope that we have never stopped voting or talking since then, but we have. I'm a holdover from the 60s, and we had extraordinary. They were extraordinary times. They were days of hope and rage. And I think a time when we really did have community. We had a very collegial, collective, communal feeling about everything, and we held all life to be truly sacred. We had movements then. We had a civil rights movement. We had an anti-war movement. We had a welfare rights movement started by women. We even had the beginnings of a women's movement. And a movement moves you towards something. It moves you toward a goal, some kind of vision. And we also had visions then. I think today we have agendas, and they just aren't the same. The facts has replaced the fury of the 60s. The press releases have replaced the passion in the streets. The company retreat has replaced the rage that we had. The computer has replaced the confrontation. And a devised sense of reality is on television. They're telling us what reality is. That's not reality, folks. Reality is paying the rent. Reality is getting a kid through school. Reality is keeping Granny from buying dog food in a supermarket. Women have been at the front of every major movement that this country has ever had. And we continue to be. And we continue to be because, as Grace Paley said, it's the small things. And as Melanie Cass said, it's the small things. And I could go on and on just about that, but I'm not going to.
I wanted to ask you kind of a personal question, but it's so inspiring to hear you speak and to be reminded about the 60s, which even I was, kind of a bit player. I remember them anyway. What was it that first got you to be an activist? I mean, I was listening to the mayor say that, we need to get activated again and we're too complacent. What was the single, if you can remember back to the single moment where you realized that you had to speak up and that your life was probably going to be dedicated to this kind of activism and that was going to be the path for you? What was the first thing that captured you?
Well, I think I do it because I want to do it, and I do it because I have to do it. I migrated from civil rights in the 50s and the 60s to the anti-war movement in the 70s, and then into the poverty movement in the 80s, when there were many more hungry and homeless people started to litter the streets. But it started when I was 7 years old and I watched my grandmother feed hundreds of men. Incidentally, they were all men who came to the door. I don't know what happened to the women in the Depression, but all the men came to our house. And when they would leave, my grandmother fed them, and when they would leave, they would take a piece of coal and they would put an X in front of the house. And that meant that to the new group coming by that this was a safe house. I think that's what got me kind of started. My background is in advertising and public relations. But in 1968, I was invited to call press for a church that was closing, the old St. Philip's, incidentally, which became Rosie's Place. And I realized there were interesting people. The farm workers had come to town, and the Black Panthers had a great breakfast program going for kids. And Dan Berrigan, the Jesuit, had burned draft files in Baltimore. And then I can remember saying to myself as I led the press down the center aisle of the old St. Philip's, I've just passed through a door and there's no turning back. And I looked around, who said it? Who said that? I said, my God, I had. And I was invited by the priest who ran St. Philip's to come with them. He said, look, Kippy, poor people need advertising, public relations, all that good stuff, but we haven't got any money. So why don't you come join us and be a member of this team? And this was an irresistible invitation to me. He said, you can do anything you want. I can't pay you much money, but Kippy, you'll have fun. Anyone who turned down an invitation like that would have to have their heads examined. Several years later, I met two priests, so that was the second time. Several years later, two of the priests that I met that night were going to go to trial in Milwaukee for burning draft cards. They did it as a religious act. As they stood around waiting to be arrested, part of their statement read, our action is not an end in itself. We invite those who are ready to lay aside fear and economic addiction in order to join in the struggle to confront injustice in words and deeds, to build a community worthy of men and women made in the image and likeness of God, a society in which it is easier to be human. And that was the second invitation. And I never had a millimeter of regret. In 1978, 4 years after I opened Rosie's, I was sitting in a cold classroom at the old Cushing High in Southie. And I heard Marie Augusta Neal, who was a sociologist and a nun with the SND, say, it's not enough to alleviate the suffering. We have to also help eliminate the causes for it. And quite frankly, my fate was sealed. And no, I'm not a born-again Sally. It worked for me the first time. But those were the moments in my life when someone said something that made sense to me. I always considered myself to be a political animal. And Jack White, the priest at Warwick House, used to say, this is not a politic, this is a theology. And from that moment on, we started to develop our own political theology. And it became who I am. And I've never had a millimeter of regret. Never.
Well, what about you, Betty? Can you think of a moment where the world crystallized for you and you realized you were going to be dedicating your life?
Well, it's interesting hearing Kip's story because it really highlights the brilliance of the 1,000 Women Nobel Peace Prize, because it really speaks to the diversity and the million ways of peace building and what it takes to actually create a shift in the paradigm that we live in. And that, Kip's sharing is so rich and so different from mine. And I'm sure it has a lot to do with where we grew up and with whom we grew up. But that question speaks to me and reminds me of my dad, really, growing up in a very rural community in Ohio. And being parented by a man who instinctively I felt voiced all of the elements and essences of peace building and peacemaking, which was really about doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. Though I never heard him say that, he modeled it. And the dignity and the grace with which he lived in relationship to his community and modeled for me what it meant to be a part of others and others being a part of me. And somehow provided the notion that what was good for our family had to be good for the community. And if it wasn't something that we would act on. So I kind of grew up with that message and never felt that it was political or a peace message. It was just the way you walk the earth. And then growing up, of course, was disabused of that in many, many different places. But it never left me as a notion that was really true, and one I would continue to refer back to as I grew up. One of his icons was Mary McLeod Bethune. Yeah, who was, there was a photograph of him and her on our mantle, and I grew up with that photograph. Going on from there, growing up, going to school, going away, going to university, I touched in on those movements, the civil rights movement and all of those things that were happening, and didn't really get snagged by political activism, really understanding it until I moved back to the Cape from Europe in the mid-'80s with a daughter who was called a nigger on the school bus in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, in the 80s. And that sparked a kind of ferocious interest and curiosity in why a child would do that to another child on the school bus. And it provoked a curiosity and an interest that wasn't reactive in me. It was actually responsive. And it planted the idea that as a community we needed to come together and figure out what was so painful in this child's and family's life that they needed to hurt my daughter. And so that led me to the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is where I found an analysis and a structure and a vehicle for really cloning my politics that were really grounded in Jane Addams and her history of suffragettes and Hull House and real compassion and deep understanding about the roots of violence and the roots of oppression. And so that slowly began to light my fires around political activism, but in a grounding of analysis and understanding, and really being curious about what would it take to heal that family that called my daughter a nigger, and shift the relationship and the need around that kind of behavior. So that went on from starting a school where I could actually practice my values about peace building with young children, and Maria Montessori, who was a pacifist and who really believed that her whole method around education was about transformation. She believed that children, in order to stop wars, we really had to change the way we educated children. And so there was another opportunity for me to actually learn and express my own deep yearnings for justice.
You know, you both mentioned in passing suffrage and the women's right to vote. And, of course, you know, the first woman elected to Congress of the United States, Jeannette Rankin, was both a feminist and a pacifist. And I've always been very interested in that connection between those two isms. And yet I see that the political activism of those early years, the pacifism and the feminism, and in some cases abolitionism also played heavily into that tradition, has really drifted away from sort of traditional politics as we think of it now. And a lot of these countries where women have been nominated, there are statutory sort of constitutional quotas for a certain number of women in the Congress and the parliaments of those countries. So, you know, a set aside for women's seats. I know I'm going to India next year, and I've been there already once, and there's a big debate there about whether to pass a constitutional amendment that would require, I think it's 38% of the seats in the Indian parliament to be set aside for women. And I'm just wondering what you think about that. Do you think that would make a difference in our American politics if instead of whatever we have, 13% of women in Congress, it was 50%? If we reached critical mass, would there be a difference? Or is it just a matter of sheer equity that we should have more women in politics? I mean, that's a whole separate thing. There's 54% of the population is women, so why don't we have closer to 50% women represented in our Congress? But aside from the sheer equity question, would there be a substantive difference in our politics if there were more women seated at the table? What do you think?
What do you think, Kip?
I would hope so. I'm thinking of Margaret Thatcher, so I kind of shifted my...
And you're an
But yes, I do. I think in the times that women have voted for women, and women have become spokespeople for a movement or an idea, there has been a lot of enthusiasm. You would like to think that if we had good men in the White House, we wouldn't be talking about what's happening either. If the same is true if we had good women in the White House. If we had good women in state government, if we had good women in local government, I think that by and large women tend to analyze more than men. And I think that they arrive at their conclusions with fairly careful, certainly social analysis. Women also pay the bills in the house, as a rule, so they have to be writing the checks, and they know how much a loaf of bread costs. I think it was George Bush who was asked how much a loaf of bread costs at a debate several years ago, and he didn't know. because he doesn't have to. Neither does Laura, incidentally. However, I think that women, because we do tend to analyze situations, we can come up, as a general rule, then, with a structure that supports that analysis. Whether or not it would work, I would hope it would. I would love to see women in the women in public office. I'm the one who pushed for Ellen Murphy to be elected when she wasn't. One would hope that with the women that I see in state government now, there are a number of them who could be absolutely spectacular. The few women who are allowed to speak in Washington, and most of them are Democrats, they really don't have the opportunity. People like Dianne Feinstein, people like was that short, adorable little one from Baltimore, Barbara Mikulski, wonderful, Barbara Lee from the West Coast. She's an extraordinary woman. Sure, I'd vote for them any day for president. Any day.
What do you think?
Well, I think I wish that I could say that if we had more women in government, we would have a different government. I don't really believe that. I think to have something different, it's going to take more than tweaking gender. It's going to require really shifting the whole electoral system and the ways in which people get elected and the ways in which people imagine that the roles they can play in the world are possible. It's not so simple as replacing gender. It's really changing a mindset. It's really changing values and attitudes. And that won't happen unless we actually have a commitment to changing the system that we are actually living in. I don't think, if we could elect Barbara Lees in this system, I would say yes, if we had 30% of those. But if they were Hillary Clinton's, I would say, I don't think gender will make a big difference. So I don't think it's about what sex is there, what gender is there. I think it's really about creating a system that will allow people to be there in ways that they can express their values, that not about how much money it takes to win or how the media allows you to participate. It's more complicated than gender.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think it's just about time to ask for audience participation, ask for some questions. I invite you to come up to the microphone, and I'll call on you. You can ask a question of the two women or even me. I have noticed in my own experience, just to finish up this last question, even at the Boston Globe, where I've worked for now 20 years, the number of women in reporting positions and editing positions, or even, I'm the highest ranking woman at the Globe, so even all the way up to the masthead, or the skybox as we call it, there really has been an increase in the number of women. It's not quite critical mass, but I have noticed that there are certain subjects that, were it not for the women journalists, probably wouldn't get coverage. I mean, domestic violence is one of the obvious ones. When I first got to the Globe, 1984, 85, I guess it was, nobody really covered that issue in a big way. And just the very presence of women in the newsroom made it, and sitting at the table deciding what stories go on page one and what stories to assign to people, did make an incremental difference in the types of coverage that we have at the Globe, but boy, we've got a long way to go. So, Kathy.
I had kind of two questions. One of the things that I think a lot about is the quote from Barbara Lee about in opposing the war on Afghanistan and then later in Iraq, she talked about the notion of not becoming the evil that we deplore, and that there's a way in which the work that we do for social justice somehow needs to embody social justice. And so I'm really interested in the two of you talking a little bit about where you see that happening, or where you have seen that happening, the kind of social justice work which has a process of inclusion and modeling peace building. I think a lot of us felt a significant shift. I know I did in past anti-war demonstrations a year ago with the one that happened recently in Washington, in which there was a very different spirit alive there, I think partly sparked by Cindy Sheehan and the voices of some of the other veterans about community building and not so much raging in an anti voice, but in a kind of visionary voice. So I'm interested in your thoughts about that. And the other piece of conversation that I'm missing at the moment is the global conversation. And in terms of the ideas about peace building, I know, Betty, that a lot of your work in the last few years has been around peace building and seeing traditions of peacemaking in other countries, and kind of how much in the United States, in addition to being the most violent country in the world, we have such a we're number one. We don't tout being number one in violence so much, but touting being number one, that we really are losing out on lessons and connections with other parts of the world. So I wondered if you might talk about that.
Great question. Let me take a little piece of it anyway, Kathy. For instance, today Boston is the highest rental and housing city in the nation. It's the 51st in the nation for access to food stamps. 70% of our school kids have to depend upon free school lunches. We have lost resources as a result of the war, as a result of the administrations, as a result of different priorities. When our government chooses to elevate cruelty to a virtue by calling it conservative compassion, this does something to all of us. An African administrator said the other day, unless there is economic development, the problems are going to continue. Now, let me take a little stroll down memory lane for about 5 seconds. 30 years ago, we all met in Chicago to talk about it, and it's terrible about homelessness. And it was. Not as bad as it is today, but it was very bad 30 years ago. And what we did was create an ethic to fit that desperate need rather than acknowledge the need for a more substantive ethic, one that would preclude the need for shelters and soup kitchens and stopgap services. As a result of the loss of those resources, which began in 1980 with the Reagan administration, the culture of this country, what we used to, Bush cries when the flag goes by, so do I, but for wholly different reasons. This could be a hell of a country, but we have a warped view of what is fair, what is honest, what is of value. For people to, our values are being created by men, incidentally. They're not being created by women, which is another point I wanted to talk about, but I lost it. The value systems that we have today are created by right-wing fundamentalist, libertarian capitalists. I'm all in favor of capitalism if we can all be one. But unfortunately, we can't, because 92, 93, 95% of the country is run by people who have a lot of money and a lot of power, and then there's the rest of us. You know, I would hope, I mean, all of the great movements that were started here were started, most of them by women. And I think that can happen again. I think that we have to simply get ourselves together and determine who's going to frame the debate. The boys that have been framing it for the past 20 years? Or are we going to have some say in it? And unless we have some say in it, things are just going to continue just the way they are. So I think it's imperative that women get their act together. And we speak in one voice, not several. Part of the problem with liberals is that they speak in 25 different voices, and their agendas are more important than yours. Well, they aren't. I learned living in Roxbury 30 years ago, hey kids, it's all one struggle. And the struggle to stay in that struggle is the most important thing we can do. And until women come to agree that housing is a right, food is a right, jobs are a right, education is a right, medical services are a right, not a privilege. And until we can agree upon that, things will continue to be as they are, which are disastrous. And I'm looking for women to lead that movement. I'm looking for women to grab that bull by the horns and say, yeah, it's our turn. And I have infinite hope. I mean, I'm a prisoner of hope. I live on hope. I can't get up in the morning if I don't have it. It's up to us. It's up to every woman in this room tonight to go out of here and say, well, by damn, I'm going to do something. And then do it.
Betty, is there an ethic or a culture of peace baked into the work of peace that you see? I think this is the question that Kathy's asking. Baked into the work of peace that you see women doing, perhaps even around the world?
Is there an essence that's baked in? I think what I have observed in the work that I've done internationally is that many of those communities are less debilitated than the communities that I find myself in this country. Debilitated in the sense that the infrastructure of their communities, even though the countries I've been working in have had some kind of civil war or internal conflict, still there is the remnants of community, and there's still a memory of a time when life was not like it was at the moment before it was shattered. And the remnants or the essences of what it meant to live together are still there, so that there is a sense of possibility that hasn't been eroded by media, by videos, by corporate concerns that still the lives and times of their children, so that adults still have a function and a role in the community to contribute in a very powerful way that's about recovering and remembering the community. So the feeling of despair and confusion and hopelessness that one senses walking around Cambridge, not knowing your neighbors, for example, in the communities that I was working in internationally, there was a sense of possibility, of unity, of relationship building, of curiosity about what's possible. and a willingness to take risks to make a different world for their children. So it is different, and I think what's profoundly different about it is that there is this sense that people have some responsibility and are taking it for their lives and their future in a way that often here you feel you can't find that place of responsibility or power for what happens to you. So there is in fact a sense of integrity and integral possibilities that exist in some of the most devastated communities that you don't find often in this place where parents actually feel they don't have any control in their children's lives anymore.
Susan, that's you.
Hi, Renee. I encourage people to line up behind me with your questions. My name is Susan Scher, and in addition to being the president of the board of the Fort Hall Forum, I welcome you. But I'm also the executive director of a national peace and security women's organization, WAND, Women's Action for New Directions. So I have a comment and a question. And the comment is regarding the elected women. And WAND used to give money, we have a political action committee, to men, and now we only give to women who are running for Congress. And because we asked them to sign on to certain protocols, we have 36 women in Congress who vote progressively, and in the last Congress they voted progressively 97% of the time, compared to the men who voted progressively 46% of the time. So part of it, I think, is also getting a critical mass, that there are enough women now in Congress that they have support with each other, which really helps. If they're just a token here and there, they can't work together. My question is, in the organization that I run, WAND, we're very concerned about a new generation of women getting involved in peace and security issues at all levels, not just in the movement level as the activists, which of course they are. They are the mainstay of the movement. But at the highest levels of government, in knowing about security issues, international security, international development issues. And so being mentored is really important. So my question for you two is, what kind of mentoring have you been involved in, and what kind of encouragement or programs do you have to suggest to the audience and the listening audience out there?
Great.
Well,
Thank you.
I think today we live in a society of cultural apartheid to begin with. And I don't think that we think about what the actual issues are, because our semantics has changed so much. What does values mean? Who sets up those values? Who creates those kinds of values? I mean, needs, for instance, as rights have slipped out of the lexicon of our language. We don't talk about needs as a right anymore. We talk about it as an entitlement. We talk about it as a giveaway. And I think that in order to bring young women into this peace and justice fold, I think we have to talk about what bothers them. Because I don't think you can make the leap you can make any kind of a leap from where you are to where you want them to be until you meet them on their own level to begin with. I mean, I certainly think that education is terribly important, and why don't we have a lot of girls in college? I certainly think that medical access is very important, so why don't we have access to it as we should have, particularly young girls? I think that jobs are very important. Why is there always such a scrabble in Washington about the minimum wage? They don't have a minimum wage. Why the hell should we? And the majority of people who work in crappy jobs are women. So it seems to me we have to help them develop an antagonism around what is being done to them in the name of good government or good economics or whatever they're talking about. I think the fact that we have slipped out of the language of rights by calling them needs is the first place that young women should start the argument. Housing, is that a right? Or is it a gift? I think we have to appeal to young women to bring them along. I think that we have to appeal to them on what bothers them most. And I think that they will make the jumps. It's very, very hard to make the jump. It's very, very hard to make the jump. And I've done this for years. I always go from A to C, assuming everybody knows what B is. Well, they don't. And half the time I don't. And so I have to go back and think about it. But I do really feel that young women have a right, as Barbara Deming used to say, have a right to live their lives. And we're not letting them do that. And I think it's up to older women to bring young women into the fold and begin talking about what their needs are. Yes, peace and justice. There won't be any peace without justice, and we start with justice for them.
You know, it's interesting, you use the term cultural apartheid to describe the gap between younger women and those of us who have been around a little bit longer. And I'd love to hear Betty's remarks on mentoring and the women you see coming up. But my own little anecdote, in my exalted position at the Boston Globe, I sometimes get drawn into these senior management team meetings where we discuss a lot of sort of corporate issues. And I was invited to a corporate discussion on diversity for the entire New York Times company, which now owns the Boston Globe. And the fellow leading the diversity workshop said that indeed, surprisingly perhaps, there was more distance along age lines in terms of communication and operating a corporation than there was along race lines or gender lines, which surprised me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized it was true. There's more difference in the experience of young people to people of my generation than there is between a black woman and a white woman, or a white man and a black man of the same generation. And, when you start thinking of that, you realize how much work there is to bring along a new generation of activists, women or young men. So, and what are your own experiences?
Yeah. A couple things comes to mind, groups. One is in this city, Cambridge, which is a very privileged city because it has something that only 3 cities in the United States has, and what it has is even more unique than the other 2, is a peace commission. And this peace commission has a paid staff in the city of Cambridge, unlike the other 2 cities. And one of the things that the brilliant executive director of that commission does is something called the Peace and Justice Corps, which is an activity, a group that holds meetings with young people from the high school that is focused on actually creating a community of young people who are thinking critically about peace and justice, and creates a space for young people to actually take risks about growing and developing into human beings that are really compassionate and informed. And I was a part of that Peace and Justice Corps group for a couple of years, and it was a very powerful way to be engaged with young people and to be a part of their education and a part of my own growth and learning by having the opportunity to be in touch with people that age. So that's one place, and I think it's a model that could be duplicated all over the country, but even all over this city. Groups of young people being mentored by adults, by just providing spaces. The other place that I have been involved is a place called Farm and Wilderness, which are camps in Vermont. And they also strive to create environments for young people outdoors to take risks, building relationships and being vulnerable and being close to the earth and close to their bodies. That's another place. But mostly, I think my most powerful place of mentoring is actually walking my talk and living in a way that invites others to be engaged in ways that I value and that I believe in. Wherever I have a chance to interrupt an injustice or to support something wonderful that's happening anywhere I might find myself.
Another question from the audience.
Hi, my name is Candice Perry. I'm from Wellfleet, Massachusetts. I'd like to know from you two how you keep from being discouraged. I think that's a big issue for all of us. I'm an activist who came to it as an adult, and I know there's still times when I think, nothing I've done is working. The hall here is not filled with people who want to know about, the Nobel Peace Prize. It would be full if it were a football team or something. So how do you keep from being discouraged? How do you keep going on?
Great question.
Let me take it to begin with.
Take it.
I learned a long time ago not to have unrealistic expectations of myself. When I moved to Roxbury 35 years ago, there were a lot of white groups there, busy doing things and cleaning up things and whatnot. And when it didn't work by Thursday, they left. What black people said to me, and I'll never forget it as long as I live, is, Kippy, nothing's going to change because you're here, but we're glad you're here. That was perhaps one of the most loving things that's ever been said to me. But I think when you have unrealistic expectations of yourself, you're going to have them of everybody else. And we really can't afford to do that. Melania Cass, if we can't do great things, let's do small things in a great way. I've never gotten burned out. And I think it was because I was taught so well so long ago that it just ain't going to happen to you, Kippy, because you're just not going to get all this done. So forget about it. Just step after step, day after day, decade after decade. I'll be 80 in June. And to tell you the truth, there are times when I feel like I'm 25 because I do have the energy and I do have hope. Hope keeps me alive. Hope keeps me running. Hope keeps me waiting for the next day. Maybe there'll be some change. That's what I want to say.
I think love has something to do with it, too. So what's love got to do with it?
Everything.
I couldn't say anything more than that. I just so totally agree that it's about non-attachment and also reflection on the history of where we've come from and yet where we have to go. But in a way, we won't get there. As Martin Luther King said, I might not get there with you, but we'll get there. And I really do believe that. And I imagine that there's a lot more suffering that will happen before we get there. But there's just so much to be joyful and celebratory in the process of getting there, in the context of community and with the millions of people who we are sitting beside in this room spiritually. There's just so much to celebrate and so much to remember, to be joyful about in the midst of all the tragedy.
You speak of non-attachment. That's a big part of Buddhist philosophy, and another thing that they talk about a lot is living in the moment. And if you can live in the moment, you don't get attached to the outcome of your work or to the future that you can't control or the past that you can't affect. So that's wonderful. Yes?
Just because I can't let my sister be the only one asking questions. I wanted to say that I feel so much love for the three of you and for everybody here and for the woman that said that she liked my pants when I came in. Because I feel like as women, we are special because we notice each other and we become attracted to one another and to each other's ideas. And you guys have heroines, and it's very exciting for me to hear the stories of your heroines. And, I read Nancy Drew, but, it's like she's not really a heroine, but it got me excited. I was a cheerleader, and, I really didn't. It wasn't about the football team, it was really about being with the other girls and being in my body. And it's not a stretch for me to think about the Nobel Peace Prize winner being a tree planter. It's like, of course, what more important work than to tend the earth, which is our body we live in, and that's connected to the bodies we have. And I think as women, we do know how to love. I mean, that is something baked within us, and because we have the body that creates the child that then thinks about preschool education as being important as housing, it's like it's all a piece, and we can't be fragmented. I mean, we see the results of being fragmented, but essentially we can't be fragmented, and we won't let ourselves be fragmented. We will have our feelings, and we will use language, Kip, the way you do to say rights, like you have the history and you remember those words. And I also just wanted to make sure we had time to read Grace's poem because I'm wanting to hear that metaphor, language as metaphor, that women, the way we express ourselves, we are inherently cellularly creative. And I think that's our greatest gift.
I think it's just about time. Can I turn it over to you, Betty, to read Grace's poem? And you want to do it up here?
Sorry?
Do you want to do it up here?
No, this is fine,
okay.
If you don't mind.
Okay.
I also want to just say that in this question that you raised about mentoring, another brilliant piece of this 1,000 Women's Nobel Peace Prize is that it is all being documented. So the lives and the work of the 1,000 women will be published, and young women and young men will be able to use this publication, this document, to read about what these women are doing and to find what they might be able to use, how they might use some of those methods and ideas in their own communities. So it's not just about nomination and losing or winning. It's about nomination and putting something in the world that's sustainable, of ideas and methods and ways of peace building that 1,000 women have created with the help of another 1,000 women on either side of them, in front and in back. So that publication was released in Switzerland 2 weeks ago, and it'll be available everywhere soon. Thank you, Candice Perry, for emailing this poem to me today. Thank you, Grace. It's called Responsibility. It is the responsibility of society to let the poet be a poet. It is the responsibility of the poet to be a woman. It is the responsibility of the poet to stand on street corners, giving out poems and beautifully written leaflets, also leaflets they can hardly bear to look at because of the screaming rhetoric. It is the responsibility of the poet to be lazy, to hang out and prophesy. It is the responsibility of the poet not to pay war taxes. It is the responsibility of the poet to go in and out of ivory towers and two-room apartments on Avenue C and buckwheat fields and army camps. It is the responsibility of the male poet to be a woman. It is the responsibility of the female poet to be a woman. It is the poet's responsibility to speak truth to power, as the Quakers say. It is the responsibility of the poet to learn the truth from the powerless. It is the responsibility of the poet to say many times, there is no freedom without justice, and this means economic justice and love justice. It is the responsibility of the poet to sing this in all the original and traditional tunes of singing and telling poems. It is the responsibility of the poet to listen to gossip and pass it on in the way storytellers decant the story of life. There is no freedom without fear and bravery. There is no freedom unless earth and air and water continue, and children also continue. It is the responsibility of the poet to be a woman, to keep an eye on this world and to cry out like Cassandra, but be listened to this time.